Okay.
Oh, I see. Don't miss the crow raid. Good one, Hans.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, don't
Had to
miss
get
that
the
one.
advertising in there. Yeah.
Very subtle.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. And thank you for taking your time off a Wednesday evening. We are halfway through the week, so we'll get there, and the weekend will be here soon. And we're going to talk about a really loved topic, that is parking. I know everyone, all of you here have some sort of a love-hate relationship with this topic, and let's see what blows up with today's discussion. We have two amazing speakers with us today, and I'll shortly introduce both of them to you. So yeah, let me just quickly breeze in through today's agenda. We'll first have a quick 5-minute introduction. Then, are you guys hearing an echo? Okay. Is it better now? Okay, thanks. Cool. So yeah, I'll quickly introduce you or breeze you through the agenda for today. We'll just do quick 5-minute introductions. Then we'll have presentations from our two amazing speakers for tonight. We have lots and lots of time for Q&A because I'm sure all of you have lots of questions around this whole problem of parking. And then we'll wrap up with some announcements and upcoming events. So jumping right in, we have two speakers with us today, and one of them is Patrick Segmen. Patrick is the founding principal of Segmen and Associates, and a transportation and planning firm which is devoted to the creation of sustainable communities. Patrick has led the transportation component of more than 70 citywide neighborhood, district, and campus plans. Many of these, such as his plans, are for Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, and have led to the implementation of innovative parking management, pricing, and traffic reduction strategies. But more importantly, the piece that I'd like to highlight is Patrick has or had some ties with SVBC. He was the very first paid employee or executive director at SVBC, and we are so glad to have him here with us today. So yeah, SVBC had Patrick and then Greg and then Rebecca as their very initial part-time employees before we had Corinne and Shiloh take the reins over. So I must say Patrick has had a very pivotal role in laying the foundation of this organization, and we're so glad to have you here after 20 years. And then secondly, we have Justin Wang, who's the advocacy manager for Greenbelt Alliance. Justin works on ensuring the adoption of equitable and sustainable housing and conservation strategies across the region. Justin uses his leadership experience and strong interpersonal skills to help make the Bay Area a better and more equitable place to live in. So I'd like to welcome both of you, Patrick and Justin, and let's get started. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So welcome all of you once again. Quick meeting guidelines: make space, take space, be aware of how much time you're talking versus listening, and allow others to speak up. Be respectful of one another and our differences. Do not interrupt when somebody else is talking. Stay on topic, try to keep the discussion on topic, and assume good intent. Quick online meeting basics: please rename yourself to include your city and preferred pronouns. Please ask questions via chat and stay muted until the breakout sessions. We went through the agenda, and I'm going to jump right in and give the ropes to Patrick. There you go.
All right. Well, thank you, Sandhya. And let me thank the SVBC for hosting tonight. It's great to be back. Parking is one of those things where until you start paying attention to it, it doesn't maybe seem that important because it's just there. But once you start paying attention, it's hard to think about anything else, or at least that's what happened to me. So I want to give you a brief introduction to parking reform and save hopefully lots of time for questions and answers. And let me start with a personal note. So this is Palo Alto. this picture. This is a picture of downtown Palo Alto. I was born and raised in Palo Alto, and my mom and dad bought their first house in Palo Alto for about $16,000. At the time, it cost 5 cents an hour to park downtown on University Avenue. So today, it would cost me more than $3 million to buy that exact same house, and it's free to park downtown, right? So in the space of a generation, we've completely solved our affordable housing problem for our cars. And I think that's backwards. We could do better. And I want to show you how some other cities have been doing better. And so let's go to the next slide. If you start talking to people about parking, they will quickly retreat into their reptilian brain often, but you could sometimes lure them out again into a rational state of thought that is less about territorial behavior. One thing you could do is explain that every parking system has two key parts, right? There is the quantity of parking, that is the number of parking spaces, and then there's the management of that parking. So do you use prices to manage the parking, for example, with meters? Do you use regulations like residential permits? What are, there's all those rules. And you have to ask yourself and ask your community, well, does your town have a parking supply problem or a parking management problem? So next slide. To give you an example, about 10 years ago, I worked on the downtown Berkeley parking and transportation demand management study. And I went over to visit on a Saturday night, and this was my first impression. Block after block, every single parking space on the street was full. And so you can imagine what would happen if you said, well, we should get rid of this parking so we can have protected bike lanes on this street. The merchants and a lot of other people would probably think there's going to be a retail apocalypse and, the businesses will all die. So what happens though if you go around the corner 100 feet away? Next slide. This is what the parking garages look like at the exact same time. Multiple parking garages a couple 100 feet away at most from where we were in that last picture, which are sitting mostly empty. And this is typical all over Berkeley and actually all over America. You'll see full on-street parking right in front of the best shops, and you'll see this kind of empty garage. A study in Berkeley found that half of the apartment building parking was empty, even at the busiest hour, which is, after midnight when everybody goes to bed. Next slide. So why does this happen? Well, in Berkeley, it's driven by a couple things. The on-street parking is easier to find, it's more visible, it's closer to destinations, it's perceived as safer, and after 6 p.m. it's free. The garage, by contrast, is further away, harder to reach, perceived as not as safe, and it costs $5 flat rate after 6 p.m. So, of course, the on-street parking is all full, while the off-street parking is half empty, and everybody thinks you can't put in bike lanes because there's a parking shortage. Well, it's actually a parking management problem, not a supply problem. Next slide. So how do we fix this? Well, there are 3 reforms that UCLA Professor Donald Shoup recommends, and which I've recommended for many years too. You should charge the right prices for curb parking. So that is the lowest price that'll get you about 1 or 2 empty spaces on every block most of the time. Actually, if you want to put in bike lanes in a downtown, you probably ought to go a little higher. That way you'll have some extra spaces and you'll be able to remove extra spaces without a problem. But the right prices for curb parking. Then to make this actually politically popular so that you can get a majority council vote in favor, you promise to return all of the new parking revenue right back to the neighborhood where it came from, to the blocks where it came from, to support public services. And once you do that, so that there's not going to be an on-street parking shortage ever, well, now you can remove all of your city's minimum parking regulations, right? If the city does a good job of managing the parking on the street that it owns, then you don't have to force everybody to build a ton of parking on their property. Next slide. So what we did in Berkeley is we started charging the lowest price needed to get 65 to 85% parking occupancy on each block. And the way it works is if the occupancy is below that, you lower the price. If the parking occupancy is above that, then you raise the price. And they do an adjustment about once a quarter. And so currently the prices have stabilized at around $1.75 to $3.75 an hour, depending on how close you are to the center of things. Next slide. And the revenue all goes back into downtown. It's not a formal policy by the city, but in fact, the city basically spends all that extra money on downtown. So it funds extra security, ambassadors on the street to welcome people, street cleanings, steam cleaning of the sidewalks, help for the homeless, and it helps maintain the parking. Next slide. Well, what happened? Well, basically, drivers surveyed said finding parking is easy. A bunch of drivers moved from the street into those underused off-street parking garages and lots. And people stopped driving around in circles in search of parking. So actually about 700,000 fewer vehicle miles per year is the estimate of how much was saved. That was by a UC Berkeley team that studied the changes. So you get all of this, and most importantly, this has been extremely popular. One city council member, when they were discussing whether to renew the program, said that this was the greatest idea they'd had in many, many years. So pricing can be really popular as long as you spend it on things that the people in the area that gets the prices actually want. Next slide. So who's removed minimum parking requirements? Well, Berkeley has now gotten rid of all their residential requirements, and the commercial ones they have remaining are really low, but lots of other cities have too. So I'm part of a group called the Parking Reform Network. And if you go to the URL at the bottom here, you can see the map and see the policies. Lots and lots of cities have removed parking requirements in some or all neighborhoods. Actually, in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Alameda, and Emeryville all got rid of all of theirs completely this past year or two. Next slide. And why would you do that? Well, one of the things that happens when you implement these reforms is that housing gets a lot more affordable and traffic goes down. So in Berkeley, one of the things we required in the downtown plan is that you have to charge separately for parking from rents for housing. So here's the Gaia building in downtown Berkeley. It has a parking fee of $230 per month per space. To make up for that, the rent is lower. So basically, the people who live there are able to save money by renting less parking. And what you wind up with is a building that has 237 adult residents, and they only own 20 cars. So imagine doing that all over Silicon Valley. We could solve the entire housing shortage and add very little traffic. And actually, if we built a really good bike network and improved our transit system while we were at it, we could do it with no additional traffic. It's actually really not that hard. These are basic economic principles and a little bit of politically adept reforms. Next. Now, what about neighborhoods? You know, suppose that you have a neighbor who wants to put up a 4-unit apartment building like this fourplex in Pasadena. Well, the first thing you hear people worry about is, oh my God, they're going to dump cars all over the street, especially if you're building a fourplex like this one that I don't think has any off-street parking. Next slide. Well, what you can do is, first of all, don't do what Boston did. Boston, in their Beacon Hill neighborhood, they gave out 3,933 residential parking permits to allow people to park on the street, and they were all free. And then they went back and counted years later and discovered, oh my, we only had 983 curb parking spaces in the neighborhood, right? So it's basically a hunting license. And this happens in cities all over the country. So next slide. One of the things you can do that is actually considered innovative in the profession of parking is that you say, well, let's give out no more than one permit for every one curb parking space that actually exists. In fact, you probably should have somewhat less. That way, you won't overcrowd the parking. There's a number of ways to do it, but one way to do it is in Tucson, they have a policy that says that for every one curb parking space that's on the street in front of your property, you can have a maximum of one residential permit, right? So if you have a 50-foot wide lot, maybe a 10-foot driveway, that leaves 2 parking spaces in front of your house, so you can have 2 permits. Well, what if you decide that you're going to build a 4-unit apartment building on your property? Well, you still only get 2 permits to park on the public street. So what does that mean? Well, you can build some parking spaces on your own property and store your own private cars on your own private property, or you can rent some spaces from a neighbor, or maybe you can rent to somebody who gets around by bike. Next slide. Now that's only one approach. Let me show you one more approach, and then I think I better turn it over to Justin. So one more approach is you can set up what's called a residential parking benefit district. And one way to do it is you charge non-residents, like maybe all the people who go to the bar around the corner, but they come and leave their car in front of your house. You charge them to park on your block. And you can also charge future residents, people who haven't moved in yet. You could say they'll have to pay a fee. And you could charge them the right prices for parking. Then you can return all of the revenue to the neighborhood to pay for whatever public services are most popular. So maybe fixing the sidewalks, installing traffic calming, whatever. And then in order to make this actually popular and acceptable to the people who've been dumping their cars on the street for the last 30 years in front of their house, you just give them free permits or maybe cheap permits. So if you do these 3 things, you can often actually get a really good solid majority. One example is in Laguna Beach. If you're a non-resident who comes to park in one of the neighborhoods near the beach, you pay $1 to $3 an hour at the meters. But the people who live there only pay $40 a year. The result of this is that when thousands of visitors pour into Laguna Beach every year to go to the beaches, they actually have the money they need from these parking fees to pay for all the lifeguards and to pay for all the beach cleanup and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of ways to do this. Find what works for the politics in your neighborhood. But next slide. I can sum it up this way. Basically on the commercial blocks, once again, like say downtown Palo Alto, you just charge the lowest price you need to get 1 or 2 empty spaces on every block. You give that money back and spend it on whatever the merchants and business owners and property owners most want. And then you can get rid of all these crazy minimum parking requirements that have created so many empty garages. And on residential blocks, you could do basically the same thing, but you can let existing residents have free permits if that's what's necessary to actually get this passed. And with that, let me turn things over to Justin. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you for giving this overview about what exactly is the problem of parking and what could be some basic ideas to get this sorted. While Patrick gave us a macro level overview, Justin is going to jump deeper into what's happening in San Jose with respect to parking reforms. So over to you, Justin.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandhya, and thank you, Patrick, for, that was an amazing presentation. So here is my beautiful title slide. About as much nature as you're going to see, unfortunately. So on the next slide, you will see a little bit about Greenbelt Alliance, how to give the little spiel. So I'd be remiss if I failed to mention that Greenbelt Alliance's mission is to educate, advocate, and collaborate to ensure that the Bay Area's lands and climates are resilient to a changing climate. And one of the ways in which we're doing this is through our work on parking policy. So on our next slide, you can see a bit of an overview of kind of the 3 ways that I'll be talking about this tonight. So first, I'm going to do give us a little more context on parking policies and their impacts, and then a deeper dive into our work in San Jose, and then finally an overview of TDM, transportation demand management, and the equity considerations that we've made. So on this next slide, I will kick us off with more data. So as Patrick alluded to in his presentation, you can see that parking is clearly very expensive to build. So one parking space on a surface lot, a very, very generous estimate for that is actually, and that's so a surface lot, you drive to Lucky's, it's not a parking structure, not a parking garage, but just a regular parking lot, flat. Is the cost of that is on the low end, $34,000. And a very conservative estimate for an underground parking lot is roughly $75,000 per parking space. So it really adds up pretty quick when you're talking about a 100, 200 unit parking garage. And actually a 2016 study found that parking minimums actually increase housing costs for renter households by 17%. And this is even for people without a car. And in the next slide, looking a little more closely at San Jose, we actually find that 1 in 10 households that rent their units do not own their cars, which is over 12,000 households in San Jose that pay for parking that they don't actually use. So this is actually $1,700 a year, again, for parking that they're not even using. So this is clearly something that affects many households, and especially low-income households. So on the next slide, just for some context to kind of visualize it, you can actually see that parking minimum requirements vary for different uses. So, and this is actually San Jose specific data. So you can see the yellow is how much area that the parking requirements would add. And then the blue is the actual commercial or residential footprint. So you can actually see that parking requirements often actually mean that parking areas take up more space than the actual occupied building space. Like if you look at the gym, like it's very little sliver of blue and then a whole lot of yellow, same with the restaurant. So parking minimums are really just driving up prices and taking up a lot of space. On the next slide, there's just another graph. This is from like a 2010 study that looked at Santa Clara County specifically. So you can see there's that gray bar, which is the range of local parking requirements. And then you can actually see, so they took a range of sites from across Santa Clara County and they looked at the actual parking utilization rate. And just by and large across the, you can see that it barely, at some points it does reach the requirements, but for the most part, a lot of these places are overparked just because the utilization is not matching the local requirements. On the next slide, you can see that parking requirements also have the potential to improve outcomes, which is to say removing parking minimums would improve greenhouse gas emissions outcomes. So as you can see that Santa Clara County actually has the highest net greenhouse gas emissions out of the 9-county Bay Area. And if you look at the color, that light green, the bulk of that actually comes from surface transportation. And of course, the bulk of that comes from single occupancy vehicle trips. And this is something that we could obviously address if we deprioritized, so much of the real estate in our cities to car infrastructure. A figure that I'm sure a lot of you already know is that cars traveling on a single 10-foot wide lane can move about 1,600 people an hour, whereas converting the same lane to a protected 2-way bike lane, for example, would allow 7,500 people to get around, and a lane delineated for transit, whether it's buses or trains, could actually move 8,000 people per hour. So cars are by far one of the least effective ways in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to move people. On the next slide, it's just another graph kind of showing the same thing. You can see that surface transportation outpaces emissions from natural gas consumption as well as electricity, which we've actually done a really good job in cleaning up our energy or electricity sources. But again, EVs are the future of cars, but EVs are not the future of transportation. So there's definitely, some good trends, but also still room to improve there. On the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about San Jose. So I wanted to start this off or frame this with our mission statement of sorts, which is by eliminating parking minimums and requiring TDM, transportation demand management, we can make San Jose more affordable, improve neighborhoods by creating amenities for families, and improve quality of life for everyone. And it's a little feel good, but this idea broadly is what's driving our work in San Jose. So on the next slide, I wanted to add these other initiatives that are ongoing. One slide back, 2 slides back, this one. So these are just some of the plans that are currently ongoing that parking reform and TDM fall into. So of course, the city's general plan, the Climate Smart Action Plan, and the American Cities Climate Challenge. These are all things that the city is considering and reviewing in order to, for a variety of reasons, but it just shows that parking minimums and TDM really fall into such a wide variety of buckets that it applies to so many different initiatives that the city is working on. So on the next slide, talking a little more tangibly about what we're actually hoping to do in San Jose, we have the aim of the policy changes, which is to ensure the right amount of parking is constructed, as well as encourage investment in a more balanced transportation system through transportation demand management. And the scope of how we're actually accomplishing this is essentially to eliminate minimum parking requirements in new development, as well as establishing transportation demand management strategy or requirements in new development. And so on the next slide, I actually wanted to feature this study that just came out from MTI. This hot off the presses literally came out maybe not even a week ago, I think, but it's very, 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 very new. And there's actually it's really good. I definitely recommend people looking it up. I have the title and the authors there. But I just wanted to pull out some highlights or fun facts from it. So assuming that the 6.2 million automobiles and light duty trucks registered in the Bay Area spend 95% of their time parked, and that figure is from a study, then at any given time, there is on average 5.9 vehicles that need to be parked. And with 15 million spaces, the average utilization rate is 39%, which implies that there's 2.6 times as much parking available across the region than is actually needed. And furthermore, while parking is on average 7.9% of the incorporated area, there are actually several areas where parking can have much larger or disproportionate impacts on the use of the land. And this occurs in locations where multi-story buildings are less prevalent and auto-centered commercial or industrial land uses with an emphasis on surface lots are found. So as you can see, there's kind of these 6 examples that they have: downtown Burlingame, downtown Walnut Creek, and they're all pretty bad. And by far the worst one is probably the Oakland Coliseum, which you can just tell visually, right? That there's that one specific land use of this sports stadium, but 81% of that land is actually just dedicated to parking. So just not quite the optimal land usage there, I think. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk about another city that did a really similar thing in Seattle. And this was done by a local scholar, CJ Gabby, and some other folks that have done some really seminal parking work. I don't want to get too deep into it, but I think the headline here is essentially that because of the reforms that they instituted, they were actually able to build 17,886, so like 18,000 fewer parking spaces at an average of 30,000 spaces, 30,000 cost per spaces, $30,000 per space. If you do the math, and that's actually lowball. If you remember the figures from before, that's a very conservative estimate that they use. There's actually a $537 million worth of savings that we were able to, or that they were able to push into other things like bikeway improvements, or just all sorts of amenities that weren't just dedicating real estate to cars. So on the next slide, again, talking a little, looking at other cities across the US that have done these sorts of reforms. You can see that Washington, DC, Buffalo, San Francisco, San Diego, Berkeley, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. Los Angeles is doing amazing things, Sacramento as well. Cities all across the US are really pursuing this because it's just a very common sense policy. On the next slide, I'll start talking a little bit more about TDM. And this graphic is super simple, but it kind of gives you an idea of what it is that we're pushing for. We're not looking to ban cars. We're not looking to stop, ban parking spaces, but we really do want to push for that mode share, right? We want to get people walking. We want to get people into transit. We want to get people in their bikes, of course. For I should have said that first. I should have read the room. This is SUBC. Most importantly, we want to get people into their bikes. But yeah, that's really the bottom line, is that we want to provide mobility choice in new development. So on the next slide, there is this fun word cloud that we put together that is a list of all the types of TDM that exist. It's fun, maybe not the most readable. So on the next slide, there is a very, very long bullet point list. So I'm obviously not going to read all this, but I think it just gives a sense of how exhaustive the idea and concept of TDM is, and it can really encompass so many things. So on the slide after that, I would, obviously, as part of this work in San Jose, a big part of the conversation was the equity considerations. So we really want to talk about and think through the supportive policies that can ease potential pain points of removing parking minimums. And of course, the headline again is we're not banning parking. People can still build parking. In fact, most developers probably will still build parking, but we're really working on right sizing it. And so in addition to removing those parking minimums, there's things like providing transit passes, ways to manage street parking through permits or other such ways, and just parking in lieu fees, just a whole range of policies that can make sure that we're not leaving people all by the wayside as we make these sorts of changes. On the next slide, you can actually see how we worked to establish an equity process. And this was something that we spent a lot of time and effort on with our partners at the city, as well as Veggielution and Luna, some of our community engagement partners, where we really wanted to ask ourselves a range of questions and kind of just have these conversations to make sure that we're establishing an equitable process. And so on the next slide, I actually outlined this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that we did to make sure we were properly engaging the community. So we started off with a developer roundtable with the Urban Land Institute. Of course, developers are a very important stakeholder in all of this. And then we also did a study session, series of online webinars. And the two things that I think were really most exciting to me personally was that we actually managed to do a partnership with Veggielution at their farm stand, which is an amazing place. If you haven't been yet, I definitely recommend checking out Veggielution in San Jose. It's really cool what they've done there. But at that, we were actually able to meet people in person, even during the pandemic, and gather feedback especially from a community that is a little harder to reach online. So that was really helpful. And we also had a partnership with Luna, which is Latinos United for a New America. And we tried to talk to people who were really entrenched in the community that really had that lived experience and have that inform the way that we went about this process. So as part of that engagement, you'll see on the next slide, they actually created a little report for us, which is there's a lot of text. I'm not gonna, I'll try to keep it very brief. But this report was really informed by outreach to residents of districts 3, 5, and 7 in San Jose. And they gave us, just some high level bullet points. I'll read the bolded ones, I guess. So they were really actually very supportive of providing a transit subsidy, subsidizing public transit service upgrades, operations and maintenance, providing a van pool subsidy, providing a rideshare program, and providing bike and micromobility network improvements. And I actually really want to highlight in the bottom left, that last bullet point, there is actually quite a bit of support for low stress bike lanes to increase the sense of safety while biking. And just general concern around bike safety in general. I think there's often this talking point that, biking is a privilege or lower income people don't bike or such and such. But really, we see that there is, a fairly large amount of support for policies of all types of mode share, whether it's transit or biking or micromobility. There's just there's a lot of positivity when we're talking about parking reform and transportation demand management. On the next slide, though, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. So there were some concerns, and the high level ones were really around pricing parking, telecommuting, and that's because telecommuting is not necessarily an option for some of these communities, as well as displacement and unease around words and development that correlates with gentrification. So, things like TDM, bike lanes, which is of course a big part of TDM, is often correlated with rising home prices or so on. And so these communities that may have seen this pattern in the past, there's definitely a little bit of hesitance. And so we really want to make sure that we're doing good engagement and taking their voices into account as we go through this process. and I'll keep going just for time's sake. So on the next slide, as we were talking about equity outcomes, we really wanted to work out on how to create a framework, like a systematic way to evaluate the equity impacts. And we wanted to, develop this set of questions that we were asking throughout the process. You can see them there. I'm not going to read through all of them. And I guess I'll close it out with just, a really quick summary. So, again, high level, why we're doing this is that when people, jobs, homes, and activities are located close to each other, we drive less and use energy more efficiently to produce less greenhouse gas emissions, which also improves the air quality in our neighborhoods. We can improve the quality of life for all of San Jose's communities with clean air, less congestion, and safe streets for all by removing minimum parking requirements and requiring transportation incentives and management programs. So clearly we still have a lot of work to do and we need to work together, but this is a great start to making progress in achieving the city's ultimate goals. And that is actually my last slide. So 20 minutes for Q&A. I hope I didn't drag on for too long.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank you so much, Patrick. That was super informative, and I know that was a lot of information for all of us to digest. And yeah, let's open it up for questions. So if any of you have any questions, feel free to post that in the chat. Meanwhile, I can get started with mine. I do have a bunch of questions for you guys. The first and foremost being we do still have a large majority of people who really think that parking is very important. Parking is very limited. We need to have more parking garages. We see so many parking garages being built even today, right next to another one that is existing. So both of you have worked with city staff, electeds, and other decision makers. What do you think so far has been the most effective explanation to explain to them that, no, we do not need this. This space could be utilized for a bunch of other things. So yeah, what is the most effective explanation?
Well, I think one, given where we are today, there are in fact lots of us who have cars and want to have a place to park them. But what we don't need to be doing that we're doing right now is having the cities in the Bay Area use a regulation that was adopted usually in 1965 or so, or 1955, to tell everybody exactly how many parking spaces they have to build on their own private property. And especially the problem is that even with a city where almost everybody drives almost everywhere, those requirements are usually far more than are needed. So it's a fairly small step actually to do what I recommended and just get rid of the requirements to build a minimum number. To give you an example, when the city of Buffalo got rid of all their minimum parking regulations a few years ago and said, hey, if you need parking, build it. If you don't, don't. What happened actually is that most of the new buildings that got built still had parking, but it was just that a bunch of them had less. Actually, the ones that had less were generally the mixed use projects like apartments over shops, because the builders knew, hey, you can use the same parking spaces to serve customers during the day and residents at night. So I think given where Silicon Valley is today, just the step of removing the minimum parking requirements so that people can decide whether they need parking for themselves is a good starting place.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, expand on that a little bit more, is just really emphasize. I think there's so often this conflation, right? That removing parking minimums is not removing parking. Like no one is going around, like if your city council passes this, no one's going around with a jackhammer to tear up your parking lots. And in fact, they can still build ample parking. We're really just removing this extraordinarily archaic, I don't think we got into it, but parking minimums are an incredibly archaic concept, I think, from the 50s. And there's really no basis for it. There's no actual, no one did a study and was like, oh, this is actually a parking minimum that makes sense. A lot of the time, it's really just people pulling them out of thin air because they think this is something that we can address within our community. And it's doing it in a very, very ham-fisted way. And so actually as part, as one of the engagements that we had with developers, we did this Urban Land Institute roundtable, and they, if anything, developers we're saying that removing minimums wouldn't even do that much, because financiers actually still, they're kind of caught up in their old ways as well. And they won't even think a project is viable unless you have enough parking. So even if you remove the parking minimums, there's still a lot of checks in place to make sure that a development has the appropriate amount of parking. But what the minimums do is really just jack that number way up. You can't even begin to have the conversation of how can we mitigate the amount of parking spaces that we actually need. And so this is really just, if anything, this is step zero. We're just giving people the flexibility to make common sense decisions for their community. So yeah, and I think that that's really compelling versus, again, we're not banning parking. We're just getting rid of this crazy requirement that means you overbuild parking when there's tons of it around. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So Patrick, you mentioned 3 steps for starting to charge right prices for parking and then moving on to removing parking minimum. So is there a rough timeline, or based on your experience of working with cities, how much time did it take from policy introduction to adoption to implementation of the policy, and then finally removing parking minimums? How much time did it take?
It really depends. I think in Palo Alto, it's probably 2 or 3 centuries. In other places, you could do it actually on the consent calendar of the city council and nobody notices. I'm joking a bit, but to be honest, a lot of people don't even know these regulations exist. So getting rid of them actually turns out to be something that sometimes the planners and city staff are the hardest people to convince, because that's what they're used to. I do think that now that we have such a housing shortage, it's actually gotten much easier to change the requirements, and I've seen adoption move very rapidly sometimes, especially in places where it was done as part of another plan. So for example, California passed the accessory dwelling unit law, and tucked into that state law allowing accessory dwelling units all over the state was a little change that said you don't have to replace parking when you turn your garage into a new little apartment. And you don't have to build new parking for the cottage in the back that you build. And so now we're seeing thousands of new accessory dwelling units happening all over the state. So that kind of policy change, if you bury it inside a bigger thing like your housing reforms, sometimes you can really make this change very rapidly.
Justin, do you have a timeline for what you're proposing in San Jose to when you see it will see the day of the light?
So this is a bit of a sore spot. So I'll say we were actually first engaged with this by the city to start working with them back in the start of 2020. So unfortunately, the whole global pandemic happened. And so that's definitely, if you actually look, as I was preparing my presentation, I was looking back at some of the old timelines that we produced. And initially we were hoping to get it done by the end of 2020. So, 1 year, pretty snappy. That has not been the case. Just because of delays. I think there's been staffing issues at the city as well. It's just been really tough to get this over the finish line. What we're currently shooting for now is hopefully a council date in June or July, and that might get pushed back a little further. So, San Jose may not the best example, but I think the timing was a little unfortunate. So, I like Patrick said, I think if the timing's right, if you have the right electeds in office, again, why local politics is really important. I think this can be something that's fairly cut and dry.
Yeah, I'm sure. And we also have a bunch of San Jose advocates with us here today who would be very supportive of all the parking reforms you're doing. Another question we have is about the parking cash out law. That there's an existing parking cash out law in California, which I don't think many people are aware about, and only Santa Monica, I guess, is using it. So can you throw some more light on that? And is that something we can advocate for with developers or cities to implement and get started?
Yeah. So parking cash out is a term that I think was invented by Professor Donald Shoup at UCLA. And it basically means that if an employer gives away parking to employees, then under a parking cash out program, they give an equal amount of cash, the cash value of the parking space, to anybody who doesn't drive and use the parking. So if you walk or bike or take transit, you get the cash value of the parking. Actually, when I was at Stanford University, first as a student, then a transportation planner, I proposed this and then we implemented it. So at Stanford, if you don't get a parking permit, you get paid cash to support your commutes in however you go. There's a state law which says that if your employer subsidizes parking and rents that parking from a third party, like maybe they're in downtown San Jose and they rent a space in a city garage, it says that they have to give employees the option to take the cash instead of the parking subsidy. And that's if your employer rents the parking space and then gives it to you at a subsidized price. So Santa Monica is the one city in the state that enforces this law, and they do it by requiring every employer to certify that they're in compliance when they get a business license and when they renew their business license. So this could be implemented and enforced in cities all around the state. It's just that nobody else has done it yet, as far as I know.
Okay. The next question we had is, are there any strategies you can suggest for overcrowded neighborhoods in the short term? Like in neighborhoods where we have a single family home but multiple families living, so they need multiple spaces to park their cars. These could be low income neighborhoods where they do not have any other place to go and their jobs are far away, so they need to own a car, and the housing deficit overall for the city is still being addressed. So what could be a strategy to deal with these issues in the shorter term?
Yeah. I think a lot of times the best thing to do is, if you go ahead and you implement a residential parking permit district, then at first, just give everybody who's a current resident who parks on the street a free permit for however many cars they're currently parking on the street. And that way, everybody in the short term, everybody who's like moved in and already expecting that, they're getting their free permits. But then what you can do is, for future residents, you can either charge a price or you can set up a wait list. And through prices or a wait list, you could eventually, as people move out of the neighborhood, you can shrink the number of permits in circulation until you get down to where the parking is no longer overcrowded on the street. And that'll solve a lot of problems, like, for example, people blocking the sidewalk and so on.
Then there are multiple questions about how to change parking in existing areas without being dependent on new development with reduced parking requirements. But I guess that points out to the strategy that you suggested, that first you go ahead and charge curb parking and make sure that you charge the prices right so that you have 1 to 2 spaces available, and move on to finally removing parking minimums. But is there anything else you would like to add on to this?
Yeah. Well, one thing I'd say is that there are a lot of changes that people can make individually. Like in a neighborhood, it's obviously really easy to fill your garage with junk, which a lot of people do now, and which actually is illegal in a lot of California cities. So when you get rid of the requirement, you're simply getting rid of the chance that people can get a code violation citation for doing that. But also, there are a number of strategies you can use. Like if you create a tax for parking, then, like, San Francisco taxes parking, and as a result, people have every incentive to put something more productive on that site. And then other ways you could do it is you can just let things evolve over time, and you'll find that once you're no longer forcing people to pour all that asphalt, actually a lot of it will turn into houses and trees and flowers and other nice things.
That's a good segue to the next question about like, do you think that the winds or the general cultural expectation of people is changing, and like there are things changing against NIMBYism so that there is less like conflict and more concession, more consensus around parking reforms? Do you think people have more understanding or more agreement towards this now, like compared to before?
Justin, I'm curious about
I'll
your
jump
take.
in really quickly. I also want to shout out, so I'm a Sunnyvale resident, and I see some members of the Sunnyvale SVBC team, John, Ari, others. Like there's I think the winds are definitely changing, and there's currently an effort being led by the Sunnyvale SVBC team to get these parking standards changed. And just so as a Sunnyvale resident, I think it's changing in my city, and I'm definitely seeing it as a regional movement too. Like we're Greenbelt Alliance, like I'm really engaged with MTCs. They're currently updating their transit-oriented communities policy, and so this is a huge bucket of money that a really big carrot that they can dangle in front of cities to encourage them to do the right thing, right? Which is to encourage mode share and so on. Dense housing near transit, and they're a big part of this planning effort is around how we can really push municipalities to adopt common sense parking reform. And so, we're really starting to see, not just with, regular people, but with staff and advocates in seeing how powerful of a lever this can be, both in, both around funds and actual, greenhouse gas emissions. Like that's a big part of this conversation. I think, going back to the first question, which is around like, how do we convince people? I had that one slide about how parking minimums, it fell into several buckets in San Jose, right? There's the general plan, there's the climate smart action plan, American Cities Climate Challenge. We're living in the climate crisis right now, right? Like we're seeing all these dramatic effects from sea level rise, from wildfires, from smoke. And this is just one way, it's not the silver bullet, but if we don't reform our parking, it's really just going to be even tougher for us to make it through the next few decades. So I think with all of this, we're really just seeing a push from people at every level, from people on the ground, from staff, and from electeds. So I definitely think the winds are blowing. I'm very optimistic. Just from SVBC hosting this forum, I think we're having this conversation more often and more openly. So I think 10 years ago, we might have some naysayers in the call. We might still do, but I think for by and large, things are looking up for parking.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I wrote an article on January 31st, I think it was published, for Streets Blog USA that talks about the national trend of removing minimum parking requirements. And it's really a wave. And actually, one of the most productive things that's happening is that states are either removing minimum parking requirements entirely, or sometimes what they're doing is limiting the level that a parking mandate that cities can impose on private people. So I wrote that article. Take a look if you're interested. And the other thing I would mention is that there is a bill that we almost got passed last year, and that we're making another run at it this year. It's called Assembly Bill 2097, I believe. Actually, let me double check. Yeah, it's Assembly Bill 2097 by Friedman. And what that does is it removes minimum parking requirements within, I believe, a half mile of frequent transit stops statewide. And that would make a huge difference. And so if SVBC can sign up to support it and send letters of support when we need it, that would be great.
Yes, definitely. I know we're at time, but we do have a lot of questions, so I'll go ahead with one more. And one question that has come up with an argument I often hear in opposition to eliminating parking requirements in California is that cities and the state offer going below the minimum number of parking spaces. So like, what are some good rebuttals to those who argue that a smaller percentage of units in a proposed development could be made affordable if parking minimums are eliminated?
Well, first of all, the actual reality is that when San Diego removed minimum parking requirements near transit, what happened is that 5 times as many affordable housing units were created in the following years, 5 times as many. And the reason is removing those minimums made it so it was actually feasible to build these new housing projects. Before, they had been just financially infeasible because so much concrete and asphalt was required. The other thing is that it's a big mistake to think that the developer is the one who ultimately pays for the parking that the government requires. The reality we know from multiple studies is that it gets passed along to the renters or the home buyers. Justin presented some of the evidence on that, but the reality is that when you impose a minimum parking requirement, what that does is it raises the rent. A single garage space can raise the rent. Now, actually, a single garage rate does raise the rent nationwide by an average of 17%. So it makes no sense to make 100% of the housing more expensive, because maybe there's a theoretical idea that's never been proven anywhere that somehow you're going to get more below market rate units out of it. The author of AB 2097, she asked the people who made that argument to provide her with one example in California of that being a strategy that created affordable housing, and nobody could give her one.
Yeah, if I can add 2 just super quick things. I know we're at time, but one thing that I actually saw today, I think it literally came out today. The UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, I think, they have a podcast, and they just released an episode today specifically on how housing shapes transportation choices. And it's actually, I think it's about an hour, but it's tremendous. They actually dove really deeply into this question of what are the incentives that we're creating when we have these parking requirements. So like, what if someone moves into an apartment without a parking space, how does that influence their decision to own a car and so on? And there's some really compelling evidence that just came out. And to add on to Patrick's first point, I think in San Diego, how by removing these requirements, we got so much more affordable housing in San Diego. Like that's very much not an anomaly. So, I glossed over the Seattle part slide really quickly, but that was, also a trend that we saw there, where just by eliminating these parking requirements, you can actually just get units that are affordable by design, right? Like that's something that this missing middle housing that we're always talking about. It's a lot easier to do that missing middle housing, to have these units that are affordable by design, when you don't tack on the cost of building a whole parking space, which, as we know, it can be very expensive. So, if you care about the housing crisis, you got to care about parking policy. They go hand in hand. So with that, I'll yield.
Well, thank you so much, Justin and Patrick. That was a lot of information and lots of learnings for all of us, and hope we can make use of all of that as we advocate for building bike lanes and removal of parking as and when required. And I'm sure the group here will have a bunch of questions even later. So is it okay if we reach out to you later with more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to move forward with quick announcements that we have for today.
All right.
So to all the local team members, we have some exciting news that we have 2 very brand new advocacy team members who are joining us today. Today is their very first day, so they're actually very brand new. And I'm going to call out to each of them, and they can introduce themselves. So Daniela, would you like to go first?
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniela Castaneda, and I'm very excited. I am I'm new community organizer, and I'm really excited just to bring the experience that I have and bring it to doing the work here to make our communities safer and more sustainable future, but also like learn new things about how to make our communities more bicycle friendly, and also like my passion is bringing like the equity piece of like making sure that we are creating these amazing communities, but making sure that 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 we're making these amazing communities for the most vulnerable, most marginalized community members. So thank you, and I look forward to getting to work with you guys.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And the next person we have joining us is Anthony Montes. Off to you, Anthony.
Hey, I've been having so many Wi-Fi and power issues since I've been back. Hi, everyone. Wow, this is amazing. My name's Anthony Montes. I actually worked in an elected representative's office before this, doing a lot of outreach. And one of the things that I am very passionate about is affordable housing and making sure that we can, bike and walk safely in these streets. For me, a personal goal of mine is to convince my mom that it's okay to let my 14-year-old brother to cycle to school. So hopefully get that that misconception that it's dangerous to do that, at least for her. And another thing is that I really look forward to actually being with you guys. Y'all are the ones like on the ground already in the trenches. So I'm here to provide you support. I'm here to empower you to empower your communities. So whatever you need, whenever you need it, I'm here for you. This is exactly what I want to be doing, serving you and helping you serve those communities. So looking forward to working together, and let's go get them.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and welcome both of you once again. And yeah, all of you will be working closely and getting to know both of our new advocacy team members better soon. With that, the next announcement we have is that we're already started working for our upcoming summit, which is the 12th annual summit, which will be happening in August. It is going to be in person this year. Finally, we move on from the Zoom room to getting back to in person. So we're looking for, so the call for proposals is out. So if you want to present anything or if you have a topic, an idea, feel free to submit using the call for proposals form. I will send that out, or Diana will send it out to the local teams later. And we have a bunch of upcoming events. We have the Sunnyvale Crow Ride, which Hans was showing up in the beginning. Then we have the San Mateo Community Ride coming up. We have the Bike Ambassador Training, Sunnyvale Boba Ride, Ride to Clean Up Cottonwood, East Side Connect. And you can see information about all of these upcoming events on SUBC's Eventbrite page or even on our website. And Hans is showing up, the Crow Ride again, yay. With that, a final plugin to join SVBC. So if you're not a member, please register or join us today. We really rely on members like you to run this organization since we're member-based. And that's it for the forum part. So I guess we can, let me stop recording.